History Secrets.
In ancient Jewish traditions, there are accounts that do not appear in the most well-known biblical texts, stories preserved in ancient manuscripts, transmitted over the centuries. And one of those stories speaks of beings called Watchers. But who were they? And why is their presence so unsettling? The Book of Enoch, an ancient text attributed to the patriarch Enoch, presents a narrative that does not appear in detail in the traditional Bible. Although the book is not considered canonical in most traditions, it was widely known in the ancient Jewish world, and its ideas deeply influenced the way certain groups understood the spiritual world. To understand who the Watchers were, we need to begin with an enigmatic passage. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. There, it speaks of the so-called sons of God, beings who relate to the daughters of men and generate offspring, the so-called giants. But the biblical text does not explain who these beings are. It does not detail. It does not develop. It only mentions and continues. Something there seems incomplete. It is precisely in that space that the Book of Enoch expands. It offers a more elaborate narrative, more detailed, more direct. According to this text, the Watchers were angels, celestial beings, assigned to observe humanity, to watch, to accompany. But something happens, something that completely changes the course of history. These beings do not only observe, they descend to earth, and they make a decision that breaks the established order. They relate to human women, and from this union, the Nephilim are born, beings described as giants, but also as figures of great strength and influence. Something there becomes disturbing. The Watchers do not only cross a boundary, they transform the human world. According to the Book of Enoch, they teach forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, magic, astrology, weapons, practices that alter the structure of society. This raises an important question. Were these forms of knowledge considered progress or corruption? In Enoch's narrative, the answer is clear. This knowledge leads to violence, to imbalance, to destruction. The earth becomes filled with injustice, with chaos, with suffering. But who led these Watchers? The text mentions names, among them Azazel, Semi-Hazah, leaders of a group that chooses to act. That establishes a pact. That assumes a collective commitment. This is significant because it indicates intention, planning, awareness of the act. Something there was not accidental. It was deliberate. The Watchers knew the consequences, and even so, they moved forward. But there's an even deeper point. The Book of Enoch does not present these beings only as rebels. It presents them as responsible for altering the balance between the divine and the human. They bring heaven to earth, but in a disordered way, without authorization, without limit. This creates a rupture, a fracture in the structure of creation, and it is precisely this rupture that, according to the text, leads to the flood, an attempt to restore order. To understand this, we need to consider the role of Enoch. In tradition, he is not only a patriarch, he is a mediator, someone who moves between worlds, who receives revelations, who witnesses events invisible to others. In the book of Enoch, he is called to intercede, to listen to the watchers, and to bring their plea to God. But the response is not favorable. The watchers will not be forgiven. They will be judged, chained, condemned. Something there reveals a clear message. There are limits, and when those limits are crossed, the consequences are inevitable. But perhaps you are wondering, should this story be understood literally or symbolically? Some ancient traditions interpreted the watchers as fallen angels. Others suggest they represent corrupt human leaders, or even metaphors for knowledge used in a destructive way. This shows that the text does not have a single reading. It opens space for interpretation. And this leads us to an important point. The Book of Enoch should not be treated as a canonical text in most tradition, but as a historical document, a window into the religious thinking of a specific period. It reveals concerns, fears, attempts to explain evil, to understand the origin of human corruption. Something there remains relevant. The idea that knowledge can be used destructively, that crossing limits has consequences, that not everything that is possible should be done. The Watchers, in that sense, cease to be only ancient characters and become symbols of rupture, of excess, of imbalance. And perhaps that is why this narrative continues to intrigue. It does not offer simple answers, but raises profound questions about power, about knowledge, about responsibility. Something there still resonates. Who observes whom? And what happens when the observer decides to act? If we go even deeper into this narrative, we perceive that the role of the Watchers is not limited to the initial transgression. There is an ongoing consequence, a chain of effects that extends beyond the act itself. The Book of Enoch describes that after the union between the Watchers and human women, the Nephilim begin to dominate the earth. They are not only large, they are insatiable. They consume resources. They subjugate humans. And when nothing remains, they turn against each other. Violence grows without control. Something there goes beyond the limits of symbolic narrative. The description points to a world out of balance, where the natural order has been broken and can no longer restore itself. But there is a fundamental detail. The problem is not only the Nephilim, it is the knowledge left by the Watchers. This knowledge remains, even after destruction. This suggests something profound. The impact of the Watchers does not end with them. It continues through what was transmitted. According to the text, Azazel teaches humans to forge weapons. Swords, knives, shields. He also teaches metalworking and the creation of ornaments. But the text does not present this as progress. It presents it as the origin of corruption. Other watchers teach astrology, enchantments, interpretation of celestial signs, knowledge that, in other traditions, might be seen as wisdom, but here takes on another meaning. Something there is redefined. Knowledge is not neutral. It can be an instrument of imbalance, depending on how it is used. This raises a question that spans centuries. Is the problem the knowledge itself, or the way it is applied? The text does not answer directly, but it suggests a direction. When knowledge breaks ethical boundaries, it ceases to be construction and becomes destruction. Another important point is the divine reaction described in the book of Enoch. Instead of an immediate response, there is a process, an observation, an evaluation, until judgment is decreed. The watchers are condemned, bound, confined, awaiting final judgment. This creates a powerful image. Beings who once observed humanity, now imprisoned, unable to act. Something there is reversed. The observer becomes contained. The agent becomes passive. But there is a detail that makes this narrative even more complex. The spirits of the Nephilim do not disappear. According to the text, they remain on earth. They become wandering spirits, influencing humanity, generating conflict, disorder. This introduces a new layer. The idea that certain problems are not eliminated, only transformed. To understand this, we need to consider the symbolic context. These spirits may represent internal forces, human tendencies, impulses that are difficult to control, or they may reflect ancient beliefs about the spiritual world. Once again, the text does not close itself into a single interpretation. It remains open. Perhaps you are perceiving that the story of the Watchers is not only about celestial being, but about limits, transgression, consequence. And this brings us to a crucial point. Why was this narrative preserved? The book of Enoch circulated widely among certain Jewish groups, especially during the Second Temple period. It was read, copied, transmitted. This indicates relevance, importance, impact. But over time, it ceased to be included in most religious canon. It was marginalized, classified as apocryphal, and that is also significant. It was considered incompatible, or perhaps dangerous, or simply beyond the scope of official tradition. But even outside the canon, its ideas did not disappear. They continued influencing interpretations, traditions, and even later texts. This reveals something important. Not everything that is excluded ceases to exist. Some ideas remain, circulate, transform. And perhaps that is precisely why the Watchers continue to be discussed. They represent something that cannot be easily resolved, a tension between the divine and the human, between what is permitted and what is forbidden. And this leads us to an inevitable reflection. If the Watchers symbolize the breaking of limits, then what are the limits that still exist? And who defines them? Something there remains open, and perhaps it must remain so, because it is in that space that inquiry continues. If we gather all these elements, an even stronger question emerges. What is actually being described in the story of the Watchers? A literal event? A metaphor? Or an ancient attempt to explain something deeper? The Book of Enoch does not answer directly, but it offers layers, and each one opens a new possibility of interpretation. In a literal reading, the Watchers would be celestial beings who descended to earth, who intervened in the human world and caused a rupture in the order of creation. This interpretation was adopted by some ancient traditions and still has defenders today. But there is another possibility, a symbolic reading in which the Watchers represent human leaders, figures of power, who abused their position and corrupted society. In this context, forbidden knowledge can be understood as practices that led to inequality, to violence, to manipulation. Something there ceases to be supernatural and becomes historical, social, human. But there is yet a third layer, a psychological reading, more subtle, more internal. The Watchers could represent aspects of the human mind itself, impulses, desires, tendencies that observe, and that, at a certain moment, stop observing and begin to act. This completely transforms the narrative. The conflict ceases to be external. And becomes internal. Something there shifts from heaven to consciousness. And the Nephilim, in this context, could symbolize the consequences of those actions. Amplified results, forces that grow beyond control. This reading does not deny the others, but adds a dimension. It shows that the text can operate on multiple levels at the same time. To understand this, we must remember that ancient texts were not written with the same modern logic. They combined history, symbol, theology, experience, all within the same narrative flow. This explains why the story of the Watchers continues to be reinterpreted. Each era reads it differently. Each tradition highlights one aspect. Something there remains alive. Not because it offers fixed answers, but because it allows new questions. And this brings us to the final point, reflection. If the Watchers represent the breaking of limits, if they symbolize the misuse of knowledge, if they point to inevitable consequences, then the narrative does not belong only to the past. It projects itself into the present. What happens when the human being exceeds his own limits? When he transforms knowledge into uncontrolled power? When he stops observing and begins to act without awareness? Something there repeats, in different forms, in different contexts. Perhaps that is why this story never completely disappeared. It keeps returning, reappearing, being rediscovered. Because at its core, it does not speak only about angels, nor about giants. It speaks about something closer, more immediate, more human. Responsibility. And perhaps that is the final question that remains. What do we do with what we know? Each historical discovery reveals new clues, but also raises new questions. Because when it comes to the past, there is always something we still do not understand. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
The story of the Gospel of Mary begins wrapped in silence, fragments, and absence. Unlike canonical texts, it has not reached us in complete form. Important parts simply disappeared over time. And perhaps it is precisely in that void where its greatest mystery lies. What did this text really say? And why was it forgotten? To understand this narrative, we must return to the early centuries of Christianity, a period marked by diversity of ideas, theological disputes, and different interpretations of the message of Jesus. Not all groups thought the same way. Not all accepted the same authorities, and not all recognized the same texts as sacred. In that context, a figure already known in the canonical Gospels emerges, Mary Magdalene. But here, she appears in a different way, not only as a follower, but as someone who understands profound teachings that other disciples seem not to fully grasp. This raises an inevitable question. Could this text be preserving an alternative tradition about the teachings of Jesus, or reflecting a later interpretation constructed by specific communities? To answer, we must observe the fragments of the text itself. The most well-known manuscript was found in Coptic, probably dated between the 3rd and 4th centuries. But it is believed that the original content is even older, possibly from the 2nd century. The text begins after the death of Jesus. The disciples are gathered, confused, afraid, and without clear direction. At that moment, Mary Magdalene stands up. She begins to speak, and what she shares is not a common memory. It is a teaching, something that, according to the text, she would have received directly from Jesus. This completely changes the dynamic of the narrative, because it is not Peter, nor John, nor any other traditional apostle who assumes the central role. It is Mary, and this generates tension, something that was not easily accepted. According to the account, some disciples question her authority, especially Peter. He directly asks whether Jesus would truly have revealed such teachings to her, and not to the others. This reaction does not seem accidental. It reflects a possible internal conflict within early Christian communities, who had authority to teach, who truly understood the message of Jesus, and more importantly, was revelation public or reserved for a few. The text suggests that Mary possesses a specific type of knowledge, not based only on external words, but on an inner experience, a direct understanding. This leads us to a deeper layer, the theological one. In the Gospel of Mary, the focus is not on church structure, nor on external rituals, but on inner transformation, on the liberation of the soul. and on overcoming the illusions of the material world. Some traditions associate this type of thought with what we now call Gnostic currents. But it is important to be cautious. Not every ancient text with symbolic language can be simply classified. What we see here is a clear emphasis on consciousness, on perception, and on liberation through inner knowledge. But what exactly does Mary describe? According to the preserved fragments, she describes a vision, a spiritual experience. In it, the soul passes through different levels or powers, each one trying to prevent its progress. These powers represent forces that imprison consciousness. Fear, desire, ignorance. The soul must recognize these forces and overcome them. Only then can it reach freedom. This type of language is highly symbolic and opens space for multiple interpretations. Would these powers be real spiritual entities or representations of internal psychological states? Perhaps you are wondering, is this teaching compatible with the canonical Gospels? Or are we dealing with a completely different tradition? The answer is not simple. There are points of convergence. The idea of inner transformation, for example, also appears in canonical texts. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, we find the statement that the kingdom of God is within you. But in the Gospel of Mary, this idea seems to be taken even further. The emphasis is not only on the presence of the kingdom, but on the journey of the soul to completely free itself from the structures that limit it. This suggests a more introspective spirituality, less institutional, and possibly more difficult to control within an organized structure. And perhaps this leads us to one of the most important questions. Why was this text not included in the canon? The formation of the biblical canon was a long process, and it involved specific criteria, apostolicity, liturgical use, theological coherence, but also, inevitably, human decisions. Some texts were preserved, others were set aside, and others simply disappeared. The Gospel of Mary may have been one of those cases. A text known by some communities, but not widely accepted, or perhaps considered problematic, especially for presenting a female figure in a position of spiritual authority. And this cannot be ignored. In the text, Mary does not only speak, she teaches, interprets, guides the other disciples. This suggests that, at some point, there were traditions where the role of women was different from what later became established. But to what extent does this reflect a historical reality or symbolic construction? This remains a debated question. What we do know is that Mary Magdalene already appears in the canonical Gospels as a central witness. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 18, she is the first to announce the resurrection. This already places her in a unique position. But the Gospel of Mary expands that role. It transforms her into a bearer of hidden teachings. And this changes everything, because it alters the way we understand the transmission of Jesus' message, no longer as something uniform, but as something plural, diversing, and perhaps more complex than we imagine. If we continue exploring the text, we perceive that the teaching attributed to Mary is not only descriptive, it is deeply structured. There is an eternal logic in the way the journey of the soul is presented. And this structure reveals something important. It is not just an isolated vision, but a system of spiritual understanding. According to the fragments, the soul ascends facing forces that question identity. These forces challenge its legitimacy, its origin, its nature, as if they were testing its consciousness. And at each stage, the soul's response is not based on beliefs, but on recognition. It affirms that it does not belong to those forces, that its essence is different, and that it can no longer be held by them. This detail is fundamental because it suggests a spirituality based on inner identity, not on external obedience. Something there did not fit within traditional structures. If we compare this with canonical texts, we perceive a subtle but significant difference. In the traditional Gospels, the emphasis often falls on faith, repentance, and relationship with God. Here, the emphasis seems to shift toward knowledge and direct perception. This does not imply opposition, but it indicates a different approach, and that approach may have been considered controversial, especially at a time when Christianity was beginning to organize itself institutionally. But there is another element that deserves attention: the reaction of the disciples. After Mary finishes her exposition, the text describes a climate of tension. Some accept her words, others show resistance. Peter, again, questions, expresses doubt, and even a certain discomfort. This reveals a possible conflict of authority, but also something deeper: a divergence regarding the very nature of revelation. Is it something that can be received individually, or must it always pass through a recognized authority? Perhaps you are noticing that this question remains relevant even today, and perhaps that is precisely why this text continues to attract interest, because it touches on a sensitive point: the relationship between personal experience and established tradition. But there is a detail that often goes unnoticed. The Gospel of Mary does not present Jesus as a distant figure, nor as someone inaccessible. On the contrary, he appears as someone who leads to self-knowledge, who directs inward, who guides perception toward inner reality. This can be seen as a continuation of certain elements present in other texts. But here, this dimension is central, not peripheral, and this can have important implications. If the focus is on inner transformation, then external authority loses part of its function, and that, historically, tends to generate resistance. Some ancient traditions suggest that different Christian communities preserve different emphases, some more oriented toward organization and doctrine, others more focused on direct experience and inner knowledge. The Gospel of Mary could be situated within this second group, but it is important to avoid simplistic conclusions. The text is fragmented. We do not have access to its entirety. Important parts have been lost, and this limits any definitive interpretation. Even so, the existing fragments allow some consistent observations. The first is the centrality of Mary as a figure of understanding. She is not only a messenger, but someone who interprets the teaching. The second is the emphasis on the liberation of the soul, not as a future event, but as a present process. The third is the symbolic language used to describe this process, which indicates a tradition that values interpretation and reflection. But perhaps the most intriguing point is another: the silence What is not in the text? What has been lost? And what might completely change the way we interpret it? What was in the missing pages? What kind of teaching was erased by time or by human decisions? This absence is not just a historical gap. It is part of the mystery itself. Something there remains hidden, and perhaps we may never fully recover it. But that does not prevent investigation. On the contrary, it makes it even more necessary. If we go even further in the analysis, we perceive that the Gospel of Mary does not attempt to establish a closed doctrine. It does not present a rigid system of rules, nor a defined institutional structure. What we find is something more subtle, a direction, a movement of consciousness. This may indicate that the text was preserved in an environment where individual experience had great value, where teaching was not only transmitted, but lived. And this leads us to a critical question. What was the role of Mary Magdalene within those communities? Was she seen as a spiritual leader, or as a symbol of deeper understanding? Perhaps both. In the canonical Gospels, she already appears as a figure close to Jesus, present at crucial moments, especially in the crucifixion and resurrection. But in those texts, her role is more narrative. In the Gospel of Mary, it becomes interpretative, and that completely transforms her function. She does not only testify, she understands, she explains, and this creates a new layer of meaning. If we observe later tradition, we perceive that this image was not widely maintained. Over the centuries, Mary Magdalene was associated with other narratives, sometimes in a confused way, other times with interpretations that have no direct textual basis. This may indicate a process of transformation of her image over time. But it also raises another possibility. Were there multiple traditions about Mary Magdalene from the beginning? Traditions that emphasize different aspects of her figure? If so, then the Gospel of Mary could be a window into one of those currents, a less known current, but not necessarily less relevant. And this leads us to a delicate point: the construction of history, the way certain narratives are preserved, and others are set aside. History is not only what happened, it is also what was transmitted and what was forgotten. Some scholars suggest that texts like the Gospel of Mary reflect an early phase of Christianity in which there was still no uniformity, in which different groups tried to understand the teachings of Jesus based on their own experiences. In that scenario, divergences were natural and perhaps inevitable. But over time, a process of consolidation took place. Some interpretations gained predominance, others were marginalized, and some disappeared almost completely. The Gospel of Mary seems to belong to this group, a text that survived partially, but still preserves echoes of a broader tradition. And perhaps that is precisely what makes it so relevant today, not as a substitute for canonical texts, but as a historical complement, as a testimony of diversity, as evidence that the beginnings of Christianity were more complex than we often imagine. If we gather all these elements, one final reflection begins to take shape. What do we do with these texts today? Should they be read as historical sources? As theological documents? As symbolic expressions of a spiritual search? Perhaps the answer is not singular, and perhaps it should not be. The Gospel of Mary does not impose a conclusion. It does not force an interpretation. It remains open, and in that space, it invites reflection. Beyond its origin, beyond its fragmentation, beyond the disputes over its authenticity, there is something that remains, a question. Is it possible to understand the spiritual through direct experience? Or must all understanding necessarily pass through an established structure? Perhaps the value of this text lies not only in what it affirms, but in what it provokes. Because it does not close, it does not define, it does not conclude. And perhaps that is precisely why it continues to be read, studied, and rediscovered. History never reveals all its secrets. Between ruins, forgotten manuscripts, and lost civilizations, there are still questions that challenge everything we think we know. Perhaps some answers have already been found, but many others remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the deepest mysteries of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
The vision described in the book of Revelation presents one of the most intense and symbolic images in the entire biblical text. A battle that does not take place on earth, but in the heavens. A war invisible to human eyes, and, at the same time, deeply connected to the destiny of humanity. But what does this battle really mean? And who are the characters involved? To understand this scene, we need to enter the context of Revelation. Traditionally attributed to John of Patmos, the text is filled with symbolic visions. It does not describe events in a literal way, but through images loaded with meaning. And one of those images appears at a decisive moment. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, there it says that there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought along with his angels. This scene marks a rupture, a separation, a direct confrontation between opposing forces. On one side, Michael, a figure already known in ancient Jewish traditions, associated with protection, justice, and the defense of the people of God. On the other side, the dragon, identified in the text itself as the ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan. But what exactly is being described here? A literal battle between celestial beings, or a symbolic representation of something deeper? To understand this, we need to look beyond the surface. The figure of the dragon, in the apocalyptic context, carries multiple meanings. It represents opposition, deception, destructive force, but it can also symbolize systems, structures, or forces that oppose the divine order. Michael, in turn, appears as the one who confronts, who resists, who maintains balance in the face of chaos. This confrontation is not presented as balanced. The text states that the dragon did not prevail and that there was no longer a place for him in heaven. This suggests displacement, an expulsion, a loss of position. But here an important question arises. If the dragon is expelled from heaven, where does he go? The text itself answers, he is cast down to the earth, and with him, his angels. This completely changes the dynamic of the narrative. Because the battle does not end, it shifts, and perhaps this has profound implications. Some traditions interpret this passage as a primordial event, something that occurred before human history, a kind of initial fall. Others suggest it is an eschatological event related to the end times, and there are also symbolic interpretations, which see in this battle a reflection of internal conflicts between awareness and illusion, between truth and deception. None of these readings can be easily dismissed. Revelation itself does not present itself as a linear account, but as a series of interconnected visions, and this opens space for multiple layers of interpretation. But there is a detail that often goes unnoticed. The text does not describe only the battle. It also describes a voice that proclaims something after the conflict, a declaration of victory, an announcement that the accuser has been defeated. This suggests that the battle is not only physical or symbolic, but also judicial, a kind of judgment where accusations are annulled and authority is redefined. This leads us to an important theological dimension, the idea of accusation, of guilt, of judgment, and of liberation. But who is this accuser, and how does he act? In some ancient Jewish traditions, we find similar figures, beings who accuse, who test, who question. But in Revelation, this figure takes on a broader role. He does not only accuse, he deceives the entire world. This expands the scope of the narrative. It transforms the battle into something that is not only celestial, but also human. Something there would not make sense if it were only a distant war, because its consequences are felt here, in everyday reality, in decisions, in perceptions, in the way truth is understood. This suggests that the conflict described is not only external, but also internal. And perhaps that is precisely why this image remains so powerful, because it speaks of something that continues to happen, even if in an invisible way. If we continue moving forward in this vision, we perceive that the battle described does not end with the expulsion of the dragon. In fact, it enters a new phase, closer to human experience, more intense, and perhaps more difficult to understand, because now the conflict leaves the heavens and approaches the earth. This completely changes the perspective. What once seemed distant becomes immediate. The text continues describing the action of the dragon after being cast down. He does not disappear. He acts, he pursues, and his main target becomes the woman mentioned in the vision, an equally symbolic figure who had already appeared earlier in the chapter. This woman is described with striking imagery, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. But who is this woman? Interpretations vary. Some traditions see in her the people of God. Others associate her with Israel. And there are also readings that connect her with Mary, the mother of Jesus. Each of these interpretations reveals a different layer of the text, but all point to something in common. The idea of a people or an origin that gives rise to something essential, because the woman gives birth to a child described as one who will rule with authority. And this detail is not random. It connects this vision with other biblical passages, creating a network of meanings that intertwine. But what happens next intensifies the narrative even more. The child is taken, protected, while the woman flees into the wilderness, a place of isolation, but also of preservation. This suggests that even in the face of threat, there is protection. But that protection does not eliminate the conflict. It only shifts it. The dragon, realizing that he has been defeated in heaven, directs his action toward what is within his reach. And that includes not only the woman, but also her descendants, those who, according to the text, keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony. This further expands the scope of the narrative. The battle is not only between celestial figures, it involves those who are part of this story. It extends. It continues. But here, an important question arises. If the dragon has already been defeated, why does the battle continue? This apparent contradiction is central to understanding the text. The defeat in heaven does not mean the immediate end of influence, but a limitation, a loss of position, a change of scenario. And this can be interpreted in different ways. Some see in it a victory already achieved, but not yet fully manifested. Others understand it as an ongoing process, where the final outcome is still to come. And there are also readings that interpret this dynamic as part of the human condition itself, a conflict between what has already been revealed and what still needs to be understood. Perhaps you are perceiving that this battle cannot be reduced to a single meaning. It operates on multiple levels: historical, theological, symbolic, and even psychological, because, ultimately, the text speaks of confrontation, of opposition, of resistance, and of transformation. But there is one final detail that deserves attention. The text mentions that the dragon acts with great fury, because he knows that his time is short. This information completely changes the tone of the narrative. It is not only an undefined conflict, but something that has a limit, urgency, direction. And this raises an inevitable question. What does that time mean? Is it literal, symbolic, or a way of expressing the intensity of the moment? Perhaps the answer is not in choosing a single option, but in understanding that the text operates in multiple dimensions at the same time. And perhaps that is precisely what gives it its strength. If we move into a deeper layer, we perceive that Revelation does not only describe a battle, it organizes a way of seeing reality, a structure of interpretation, where invisible forces influence visible events, and where what happens in the spiritual realm directly impacts human experience. But this leads us to a delicate question. To what extent should this battle be understood as something external? And to what extent does it reflect internal processes? Some mystical interpretations suggest that the figure of the dragon represents more than a being. It may symbolize a set of forces that distort perception, deception, illusion, identification with what is not essential. In this sense, the battle described can be understood as a conflict between clarity and confusion, between awareness and conditioning. Michael, in this context, would not be only a celestial warrior, but the expression of a higher order, a force that restores balance, that separates what is true from what is illusory. This reading does not negate traditional interpretations, but expands the field of understanding. It allows the text to be seen not only as prophecy, but as reflection. But it is important to remain cautious. Revelation itself does not explain its images directly. It presents symbols and allows the reader to participate in the process of interpretation. This requires attention and also humility before the text. Another relevant aspect is the repetition of patterns throughout the scriptures. The idea of conflict between opposing forces is not exclusive to Revelation. It appears in different forms throughout biblical tradition. But here, it reaches a maximum level of intensity, a final synthesis, a moment where accumulated tensions seem to converge. And perhaps that is why this vision remains so impactful. It does not offer only a narrative, but a powerful, symbolic structure that can be applied to different contexts: historical, spiritual, and even existential. But there is something that cannot be ignored. The text does not end with the battle. It points to something more, toward an outcome, toward a restoration, even if it is not immediately described. This suggests that the conflict has a purpose, or at least a direction. It is not only destruction, but part of a greater process. And that completely changes the way we interpret the narrative, because the battle ceases to be an isolated event and becomes part of a broader story, a story that is still unfolding. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this passage so relevant. It does not speak only of a distant time, but of something that continues to happen, in different forms, in different contexts, but with the same fundamental structure: conflict, choice, transformation. And perhaps, in the end, the most important question is not about the dragon, nor about Michael, but about what this battle reveals, about how we perceive reality, and about how we face what opposes truth. Because, in some way, this battle does not occur only in heaven. It also occurs within us. The history of humanity is a journey filled with discoveries, enigmas, and mysteries. Some have been understood. Others still challenge our understanding. And it is precisely in these mysteries that we find the most fascinating questions. Subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the secrets of history, because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.